Welcome to Bedtime Horror, where the darkness holds more than just dreams. I'm your host, and tonight we're diving into something that will make you question everything you thought you knew about what's really out there in the vast emptiness above us. You know that feeling when you're lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, and your mind starts to wander? You think about the infinite blackness beyond our atmosphere, those countless stars scattered like dust across an endless canvas. Most nights, that thought is comforting. But some nights, when the world is perfectly still and you're caught between waking and sleeping, a different thought creeps in. What if something out there is staring back? Tonight, we're exploring true encounters with the unknown, real people, ordinary lives, extraordinary experiences that defy explanation. These aren't Hollywood fantasies or internet rumors. These are first-hand accounts from witnesses who never asked to become part of something bigger than themselves. People who were simply going about their daily routines when reality decided to bend the rules. I've spent months collecting these stories, verifying details, speaking with witnesses who've carried these secrets for years, sometimes decades. What you're about to hear isn't designed to convince you of anything. It's not about belief or skepticism. It's about human experience in its rawest form, moments when the impossible becomes undeniably real. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the familiar sounds of your own space ground you. Because once we begin this journey together, the ordinary world around you might start to feel a little less certain, a little more mysterious, and that's exactly where we need to be. Our first story comes from Sarah Chen, a night shift nurse from Portland, Oregon. Sarah worked at a small community hospital on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where most nights were quiet and predictable. She'd been pulling 12-hour shifts for nearly 8 years, so she knew the rhythm of her workplace like a heartbeat. The soft hum of fluorescent lights, the distant beeping of monitors, the gentle swoosh of automatic doors opening and closing as staff moved through the corridors. But on this particular October night in 2019, that familiar rhythm was about to be shattered. Sarah was making her rounds around 2:30 in the morning when she noticed something odd through the large windows at the end of the hallway. The hospital sat on a small hill overlooking a residential area, and normally you could see the scattered lights of houses below, maybe the occasional car moving down the main road. But tonight, there was something else. 3 lights hung in the air above the neighborhood, perfectly still, arranged in a triangle formation. They weren't airplane lights. She knew what those looked like. These were different, steady and bright, with a soft, blue-white glow that seemed to pulse gently, like slow breathing. Sarah stopped walking and stared. The lights hovered maybe 200 feet above the houses, completely motionless. No sound reached her through the thick hospital windows, but something about their presence made the hair on her arms stand up. She pulled out her phone to take a picture, but when she looked at the screen, it showed nothing but darkness where the lights should have been. She tried again, adjusting the settings, but the camera refused to capture what her eyes could clearly see. Frustrated, she looked back up at the lights, and that's when they began to move. The triangle formation shifted, rotating slowly like a wheel turning in the sky. The lights maintained their perfect spacing as they spun, creating a hypnotic pattern against the dark backdrop of the night. Sarah found herself unable to look away, transfixed by the smooth, deliberate motion. Then, without warning, the lights stopped rotating and began to descend. They moved together, maintaining their triangular formation as they lowered toward the residential area below. Sarah watched in fascination and growing unease as they settled just above the rooftops, maybe 30 feet off the ground. The blue-white glow intensified, casting strange shadows between the houses. That's when Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. The entire neighborhood had gone dark. Not just the streetlights, but every house, every porch light, every electronic glow that usually dotted the landscape at night. It was as if the lights in the sky had somehow drained all the power from the area below them. She stood frozen at the window, her rational mind trying to process what she was seeing. Power outages happened, sure, but not like this. Not in perfect synchronization with mysterious lights appearing overhead, and the silence, even through the hospital windows, felt oppressive, unnatural. The lights hovered over the darkened neighborhood for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Sarah lost track of time completely, mesmerized by their presence. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they began to rise again. The ascent was slow at first, the triangle formation lifting steadily into the night sky. But as they gained an altitude, their movement accelerated. Sarah watched as they climbed higher and higher, the blue-white glow fading as they disappeared into the darkness above. The moment the lights vanished, the neighborhood below came back to life. House lights flickered on, street lamps resumed their steady glow, and the normal nighttime landscape was restored as if nothing had ever happened. Sarah remained at the window for another 20 minutes, scanning the sky for any sign of the light's return. But the night had returned to normal, and eventually her duties called her back to her rounds. She checked on her patients, completed her paperwork, and tried to focus on the familiar routine of her job, but she couldn't shake what she'd seen. The next morning, she mentioned it to a few colleagues during shift change, describing the lights and the power outage. To her surprise, several other staff members nodded in recognition. They'd seen the lights too, from different windows throughout the hospital. The security guard mentioned that the hospital's backup generators had kicked in briefly around the same time, though the main power had never actually failed. Sarah went home that morning with more questions than answers. She searched online for reports of power outages in the area but found nothing. No news stories, no utility company statements, no social media posts from residents complaining about losing electricity. It was as if the event had been completely invisible to everyone except those watching from the hospital. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself paying closer attention to the night sky during her shifts. She never saw the lights again, but the memory of that October night remained vivid and unsettling. The way they had moved with such deliberate purpose, the perfect synchronization with the power failure, the complete absence of any official acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred. What struck her most wasn't just the strangeness of the lights themselves, but the profound sense that she had witnessed something intentional. These weren't random atmospheric phenomena or equipment malfunctions. They had moved with intelligence, with purpose, as if guided by some form of consciousness that existed beyond human understanding. Sarah continued working her night shifts, but she never looked at the sky quite the same way again. And sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, when the hospital corridors were still and the world outside seemed to hold its breath, she would find herself standing at that same window, watching, waiting, wondering if they might return. Our next encounter takes us to rural Montana, where retired rancher Tom Hawkins experienced something that would fundamentally change his relationship with the land he'd worked for over 40 years. Tom had spent his entire adult life on his family's cattle ranch, 3,000 acres of rolling grassland nestled in a valley between two mountain ridges. He knew every fence line, every watering hole, every seasonal pattern that shaped life on the range. The rhythms of ranch work had become second nature to him, sunrise to sunset routines that connected him to the land in ways city folks could never understand. But on a clear September evening in 2020, those familiar rhythms were interrupted by something Tom had never encountered in all his years under the Montana sky. He was driving his pickup truck along the perimeter road, checking on a section of fencing that had been damaged in a recent storm. The sun had set about an hour earlier, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Tom had made this same drive thousands of times, following the dirt track that wound along the edge of his property where it bordered government land. That's when he saw the glow. At first, he thought it might be a grass fire, that orange-red light flickering against the hillside about a mile away. Wildfires were always a concern in that part of Montana, especially during dry seasons, so Tom immediately pulled over and grabbed his binoculars from the glove compartment. But what he saw through the lenses wasn't fire at all. A large, disc-shaped object sat on the ground in a clearing between two stands of pine trees. The glow, Tom had noticed, was coming from the craft itself, a warm amber light that seemed to emanate from its entire surface rather than from any specific source. The object was bigger than his house, maybe 60 feet across, with a smooth, seamless exterior that reflected the light in strange, shifting patterns. Tom lowered the binoculars and rubbed his eyes, convinced he must be seeing things. But when he looked again, the object was still there, real and solid and utterly impossible. As he watched, a section of the craft's surface began to change. What had appeared solid and featureless started to shift, like liquid metal flowing upward to create an opening. The amber glow from inside spilled out into the clearing, illuminating the surrounding trees with an otherworldly radiance. That's when Tom saw them. Figures emerged from the opening, tall and slender, moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost dance-like. Even at a distance of nearly a mile, Tom could see that they weren't human. Their proportions were wrong, their movements too smooth, too coordinated. They appeared to be examining the area around their craft, bending down to touch the ground, reaching up to brush against low-hanging branches. Tom felt his heart hammering in his chest as he watched the scene unfold. Part of him wanted to drive closer, to get a better look at what was happening in that clearing. But a deeper, more primal instinct told him to stay hidden, to observe from a distance without drawing attention to himself. The figures continued their exploration for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. They moved methodically through the clearing, their attention focused on the natural environment around them. Tom noticed that wherever they walked, the grass seemed to glow faintly, as if their presence was somehow energizing the vegetation. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures began to return to their craft. They moved in single file back toward the opening, disappearing one by one into the amber glow within. The last figure paused at the threshold and turned, looking directly across the valley toward where Tom was hidden in his truck. Even at that distance, Tom felt the weight of that gaze, the unmistakable sense that he was being observed in return. The figure stood motionless for several long seconds, then raised what might have been an arm in a gesture that could have been acknowledgement, or warning, or farewell. Then it too disappeared into the craft. The opening in the side of the object began to close, the liquid metal flowing back into its original, seamless form. The amber glow intensified briefly, then dimmed to a soft pulse. Without any sound that Tom could hear, the craft began to rise from the clearing. It lifted straight up, slow and steady, until it cleared the tops of the pine trees. Then it tilted slightly and began to move horizontally, gliding silently across the valley. Tom tracked its movement through his binoculars as it passed overhead, perhaps 500 feet above the ground. The craft moved with impossible smoothness, no visible means of propulsion, no exhaust or disturbance in the air around it. As it reached the far side of the valley, it began to climb again, ascending at an increasingly steep angle until it was just a point of light against the star-filled sky, and then it was gone. Tom sat in his truck for a long time after the craft disappeared, trying to process what he had witnessed. The rational part of his mind searched for conventional explanations, military aircraft, experimental technology, some kind of elaborate hoax, but nothing could account for what he had seen with his own eyes. The next morning, Tom drove to the clearing where the craft had landed. He found a perfect circle of grass that had been flattened but not damaged, pressed down as if by tremendous weight, but still green and healthy. More intriguingly, the grass within the circle seemed more vibrant than the surrounding vegetation, greener and more lush despite having been compressed just hours earlier. Tom took photographs of the site and collected soil samples, though he wasn't sure what he planned to do with them. He told his story to a few close friends and family members, but their reactions ranged from polite skepticism to outright disbelief. Eventually, he stopped talking about it altogether, but the experience had changed something fundamental in Tom's relationship with his land. He found himself spending more time outdoors at night, scanning the sky with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The vast Montana wilderness that had always felt like home now seemed somehow larger, more mysterious, filled with possibilities he had never imagined. And sometimes, on clear nights when the stars seemed particularly bright, Tom would drive out to that same spot on the perimeter road and wait, watching, wondering if they might return to the clearing between the pine trees. The circle in the grass faded over time, but Tom never forgot the sight of those graceful figures moving through the amber glow, or the weight of that final gaze across the valley. Whatever they were, wherever they had come from, they had chosen his land for their brief visit to our world, and that knowledge, unsettling as it was, had become part of who he was. Our third story tonight comes from Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a marine biologist who encountered something extraordinary while conducting research off the coast of Northern California. Jennifer had spent 15 years studying deep-sea ecosystems, but nothing in her scientific training had prepared her for what she would discover during a routine data collection dive in the summer of 2018. Jennifer was part of a small research team aboard the vessel Pacific Explorer, investigating unusual sonar readings that had been detected in a remote section of the Monterey Canyon. The readings suggested the presence of large, structured objects on the ocean floor at a depth of nearly 2,000 feet, far too deep for conventional diving, but perfect for their remotely operated vehicle. The ROV descended through the darkness, its powerful lights cutting through the black water as it approached the coordinates where the anomalous readings had been detected. Jennifer monitored the live feed from the surface, watching as the familiar landscape of the deep ocean floor came into view. What she saw next would challenge everything she thought she knew about life beneath the waves. Resting on the canyon floor, partially embedded in the sediment, was a structure unlike anything in Jennifer's extensive knowledge of marine geology. It appeared to be artificial, constructed from what looked like a dark, metallic material that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the ROV's lights. The structure was massive, easily the size of a city block, with smooth curved surfaces that formed geometric patterns too precise to be natural. But what truly captured Jennifer's attention wasn't the structure itself, it was what was happening around it. The water in the immediate vicinity was glowing with a soft, phosphorescent light that had no identifiable source. Schools of deep-sea fish that should have been scattered across the ocean floor were instead moving in perfect formation around the structure, their bioluminescent organs pulsing in synchronized patterns. It was as if the entire ecosystem in that area had been somehow reorganized, transformed into something far more complex and coordinated than anything Jennifer had observed in nature. As the ROV moved closer, its cameras revealed details that made Jennifer's scientific mind reel. The structure's surface wasn't simply smooth, it was actively changing, shifting like liquid while maintaining its solid form. Sections would bulge outward, then flatten, creating wave-like patterns that rippled across the entire edifice. And with each change, the surrounding marine life responded, their movements becoming more elaborate, more purposeful. Jennifer called the rest of her team to the monitor, but as they gathered around the screen, something extraordinary happened. The structure began to emit a low-frequency sound, so deep it was felt more than heard, vibrating through the ship's hull and into their bones. The sound created visible patterns in the water, geometric shapes that formed and dissolved in perfect symmetry. The marine life responded immediately. Fish that had been circling the structure began to spiral upward in a massive column, their bioluminescence creating a pillar of living light that stretched from the ocean floor toward the surface. Other creatures, things Jennifer couldn't immediately identify, emerged from crevices in the structure itself, long and serpentine, moving with an intelligence that seemed far beyond anything in the known catalog of deep-sea species. Dr. Walsh tried to record everything, but the ROV's equipment was behaving strangely. The cameras would focus and unfocus on their own. The audio pickups were registering sounds at frequencies that shouldn't have been possible underwater, and the positioning system kept showing readings that placed the ROV in locations that defied the laws of physics. Then the structure began to rise. What Jennifer had assumed was a stationary installation revealed itself to be something far more incredible. The massive object lifted from the canyon floor with impossible grace, sediment falling away from its surface like water. As it ascended, the column of bioluminescent marine life rose with it, creating a spectacular display of coordinated movement that stretched through hundreds of feet of ocean. The ROV's cameras tracked the structure as it climbed through the water column, its form becoming clearer as it moved into better lighting conditions. Jennifer could see now that it wasn't a single solid object, but rather a collection of interconnected modules, each one pulsing with that same soft internal glow. The modules shifted position relative to each other as they rose, reconfiguring into new patterns that seemed to serve different purposes at different depths. At 1,500 feet, the structure paused. The marine life that had been accompanying its ascent began to disperse, returning to their normal depths and behaviors as if released from some kind of coordinating influence. The structure itself began to change more dramatically, its modular components separating and rearranging into a formation that Jennifer's mind struggled to categorize. Then it began to move horizontally, gliding through the water with a speed and efficiency that violated everything Jennifer knew about hydrodynamics. No propulsion was visible, no disturbance in the surrounding water, just smooth, purposeful movement toward the edge of the canyon. Jennifer ordered the ROV to follow, but the remotely operated vehicle's systems were increasingly unreliable. The video feed flickered between crystal clear images and complete static. The control responses became delayed and erratic, and several monitoring systems simply shut down without explanation. Through the intermittent feed, Jennifer caught glimpses of the structure as it reached the canyon wall. Instead of following the underwater topography, it began to ascend the sheer rock face, its modular components reconfiguring once again into a more streamlined formation. The ascent was rapid, much faster than the ROV could match, and within minutes the structure had disappeared beyond the range of their cameras. But Jennifer's instruments detected something else, something that would haunt her for years to come. As the structure vanished from sight, her sonar equipment registered multiple large objects moving at incredible speed through the water above them, too fast and too coordinated to be any known marine life or human technology. The objects were heading toward the surface. Jennifer tried to track them, but her equipment was failing systematically. One by one, the ROV's systems went offline until only the basic video feed remained. Through the grainy, flickering image, she watched as strange lights began to appear in the water above, growing brighter as they approached the surface. Then the video feed cut out entirely. When the ROV's systems came back online 20 minutes later, everything had returned to normal. The canyon floor showed no sign that the massive structure had ever been there, just the usual sediment and scattered marine life. The water chemistry readings were normal, the fish were behaving according to expected patterns, and the phosphorescent glow that had illuminated the entire area was gone. Jennifer's team spent the next 3 days searching the area with every instrument at their disposal, but they found nothing unusual. No trace of the structure, no evidence of the coordinated marine behavior, no explanation for the systematic equipment failures they had experienced. The official report filed with their research institution described the incident as a combination of equipment malfunction and unusual but explainable marine phenomena. But Jennifer knew what she had witnessed went far beyond the boundaries of conventional science. In the months that followed, she began investigating similar reports from other marine researchers around the world. She found accounts of structures on ocean floors that appeared and disappeared without explanation, of marine life exhibiting impossible levels of coordination, of equipment failures that followed specific patterns during deep-sea research missions. Most intriguingly, she discovered reports from coastal observation stations of unusual lights emerging from the ocean at night, lights that moved with purpose and intelligence before disappearing into the sky above. Jennifer began to understand that the ocean, which covered more than 70% of Earth's surface and remained largely unexplored, might be hiding far more than new species of fish or undiscovered geological formations. The deep waters might be home to intelligence that operated according to rules and purposes that human science was not yet equipped to understand. She continued her research, but with a new awareness that every dive into the deep ocean was potentially an encounter with something extraordinary. The familiar marine environments she had studied for years now seemed vast and mysterious, filled with possibilities that both thrilled and unsettled her scientific worldview. And sometimes, when reviewing sonar data from her expeditions, Jennifer would notice anomalies that couldn't be explained by conventional marine science. Readings that suggested large, moving objects in the deep water, patterns of behavior among marine life that seemed too coordinated to be natural, signatures that appeared briefly on her instruments before vanishing without a trace. The ocean, she realized, was keeping secrets that humanity was only beginning to glimpse. These accounts, these moments when ordinary people find themselves face to face with the extraordinary, remind us that the universe is far larger and stranger than our daily lives allow us to consider. Sarah watching lights dance over a darkened neighborhood, Tom witnessing graceful figures moving through amber glow, Jennifer discovering intelligence in the deep ocean. Each of them was forever changed by their encounter with something beyond conventional explanation. But what makes these stories particularly compelling isn't just their strangeness, it's their consistency. Across different locations, different times, different circumstances, we see similar patterns emerging. Lights that move with purpose, beings that observe and interact with our environment, technology that operates according to principles we don't understand, and always, that sense of intelligence behind the phenomena. These aren't random events or natural anomalies. They suggest something far more profound, the presence of consciousness that exists alongside our own, sharing this planet and perhaps this solar system in ways we're only beginning to recognize. As we continue our journey through these encounters tonight, that pattern will become even more apparent. The experiences we're exploring aren't isolated incidents. They're glimpses into a larger reality that operates just beyond the edge of our normal perception. And perhaps that's why these stories resonate so deeply, because on some level, we all sense that there's more to existence than what we see in our daily lives. We all have those moments, late at night or in quiet places, when we feel the presence of something vast and unknowable just beyond our awareness. Tonight we're going to encounter something that challenges Not just what we think we know about visitors from beyond our world, but what we understand about the very nature of consciousness itself. Because sometimes the most profound encounters aren't about seeing strange lights in the sky or witnessing impossible technology. Sometimes they're about the moment when something reaches directly into your mind and makes contact in ways that bypass every defense mechanism evolution has given us. Our next story comes from Marcus Rivera, a long haul trucker who spent 23 years driving the empty highways that connect America's forgotten corners. Marcus knew the road like most people know their own neighborhood, every truck stop, every stretch of pavement where the cell towers gave out, every place where the darkness seemed to press in a little closer than it should. Marcus was hauling electronics from Phoenix to Denver on a route he'd driven hundreds of times before. It was late February 2021, one of those crystal clear winter nights when the stars seemed close enough to touch and the cold made everything sharp and immediate. He was making good time on Interstate 25, about 50 miles south of Santa Fe, when he noticed something unusual in his mirrors. A light was following him. At first, Marcus assumed it was another truck running behind him, maybe someone trying to maintain a good pace through the mountain passes. But as he watched, the light began to behave in ways that didn't make sense. It would fall back until it was barely visible, then suddenly appear much closer without any apparent acceleration. It would drift from one side of the highway to the other, maintaining the same distance, but moving with a fluid motion that no ground vehicle could achieve. Marcus had been driving long enough to recognize when something wasn't right. He slowed down, expecting the light to pass him, but it slowed as well. He sped up, and it matched his pace perfectly. Whatever was back there, it was deliberately staying with him. The highway stretched ahead through high desert country, empty and dark, except for his headlights cutting through the night. No other traffic, no towns for miles, just the endless ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the darkness. Marcus felt increasingly isolated, aware that he was alone with whatever was following him on this remote stretch of road. That's when the CB radio crackled to life. The sound that came through the speaker wasn't quite static and wasn't quite a voice. It was something in between, a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to carry meaning, even though Marcus couldn't understand what that meaning might be. The sound had a hypnotic quality, rising and falling in patterns that felt almost musical. Marcus tried to respond, keying his microphone and asking if anyone was out there, but his own voice came back distorted, stretched and warped until it was barely recognizable. The strange pulsing continued, growing stronger and more complex, as if whatever was transmitting was learning how to use the radio frequency more effectively. Then the sound changed. What had been abstract pulsing began to resolve into something that resembled language. Not English, not any human language Marcus had ever heard, but something with structure and rhythm that his mind tried desperately to parse. The syllables, if they were syllables, seemed to bypass his ears entirely and resonate directly in his consciousness. And then, impossibly, Marcus began to understand, not the words themselves, but the meaning behind them. Images flooded his mind, visions of vast distances and impossible journeys, of civilizations that spanned star systems and consciousnesses that existed on scales he couldn't comprehend. He saw Earth from perspectives no human had ever experienced, not just from orbit, but from dimensions of awareness that encompass the planet's entire history and future simultaneously. The communication wasn't threatening or demanding. If anything, it felt curious, almost gentle, like a scientist studying a fascinating specimen. Marcus had that overwhelming sense that something was examining not just him, but humanity as a whole, trying to understand what drove his species, what made them unique among the countless forms of life scattered across the galaxy. Through this mental connection, Marcus glimpsed fragments of knowledge that his human brain could barely process. He saw technologies that transformed matter at the atomic level, transportation methods that folded space itself, civilizations that had learned to exist as pure consciousness without physical form. But more than the technology, he sensed the profound loneliness of intelligences so advanced that they rarely encountered others capable of meaningful communication. The experience felt like it lasted for hours, but when Marcus checked his clock, only minutes had passed. The light in his mirrors was gone, the CB radio had returned to normal static, and the highway ahead looked exactly as it should. But Marcus knew he had been fundamentally changed by what had just occurred. The knowledge that had been shared with him didn't fade like a dream. Instead, it settled into his consciousness like sediment, becoming part of his understanding of reality. He found himself aware of things he had never learned, sensitive to patterns and connections that had been invisible before his encounter on that lonely stretch of highway. Marcus completed his delivery in Denver, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his encounter had been more than just random contact. There had been something purposeful about it, as if he had been selected for reasons he didn't understand. Over the following weeks, he began to notice changes in himself, subtle alterations in his perception and thinking that suggested his mind had been somehow enhanced by the experience. He started seeing patterns in the landscape that revealed hidden structures, recognizing signs of intelligence and purpose in places where others saw only natural formations. His dreams became incredibly vivid, filled with images of places he had never been and beings he had never imagined. And sometimes, late at night on empty highways, he would catch glimpses of lights in the distance that moved with the same fluid grace he had witnessed that February night. Marcus never reported his experience to any official agency. He knew instinctively that what had happened to him was part of something larger, a gradual process of contact and communication that operated according to rules and timelines far beyond human understanding. He had been chosen to receive a small piece of a vast puzzle, and his role was to carry that knowledge forward, even if he never fully understood its significance. But the encounter had given Marcus something precious, the absolute certainty that humanity was not alone in the universe, and that the intelligence they shared it with was far more benevolent and curious than fearful. The loneliness that had always been part of his long-haul lifestyle was replaced by a sense of connection to something infinite and wonderful. And sometimes, when the night was particularly clear and the highway stretched endlessly ahead, Marcus would key his CB microphone and send out a simple message into the darkness, hoping that somewhere out there, something might be listening and remember their brief moment of perfect communication. Our next encounter takes us to the suburbs of Minneapolis, where a family's quiet evening was interrupted by visitors who seemed more interested in observation than contact. The Hendersons had lived in their modest two-story home for 12 years, raising 3 children in a neighborhood where the most exciting events were usually school fundraisers and the occasional garage sale. But on a humid August night in 2019, their predictable suburban routine was shattered by an experience that would divide their family and challenge everything they thought they knew about privacy and protection. It started with their youngest daughter, 8-year-old Emma, who came downstairs around 10 o'clock, complaining that someone was watching her through her bedroom window. Tom Henderson, a practical man who worked in insurance, assumed she had seen tree branches moving in the wind, or perhaps the neighbor's security light casting strange shadows. He walked Emma back upstairs to show her there was nothing to worry about. But when they reached her room, Tom saw immediately that his daughter hadn't been imagining things. Standing in the backyard, perfectly still beneath the old oak tree, were 3 figures. They were tall and thin, wearing what looked like dark, form-fitting clothing that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their faces were pale and featureless in the dim glow from the Hendersons' porch light, but Tom could sense that they were looking directly at the house, specifically at Emma's second-floor window. Tom's first instinct was protective anger. Someone was in his yard, watching his children, and that was completely unacceptable. He told Emma to go to her parents' bedroom and stay with her mother, then headed downstairs to confront the intruders. But when Tom reached the back door and flipped on the powerful security lights that illuminated the entire yard, the figures didn't run or hide. They simply stood there, unmoving, as if the sudden brightness had no effect on them whatsoever. Up close, Tom could see that they weren't wearing clothes at all. What he had taken for dark garments was actually their skin, smooth and matte, like polished stone. Tom shouted at them to leave his property, but they showed no reaction to his voice. He considered calling the police, but something about the situation felt beyond the scope of normal law enforcement. These weren't burglars or peeping Toms. They were something else entirely, and Tom's rational mind struggled to categorize what he was seeing. That's when his wife Linda appeared beside him, having heard the commotion from upstairs. Her gasp of shock confirmed that Tom wasn't hallucinating. The figures were real, and they were still standing motionless in the Hendersons' backyard, their attention focused on the house with an intensity that felt almost tangible. Linda wanted to call 911 immediately, but Tom hesitated. What would they tell the dispatcher? That 3 strange people were standing in their yard? That they looked inhuman? That they seemed to be studying the house and its occupants with scientific detachment? Before they could decide on a course of action, the figures began to move. They didn't walk in any conventional sense, but rather glided across the grass with a fluid motion that reminded Tom of dancers or swimmers moving through water. They maintained their triangular formation as they approached the house, stopping just outside the circle of light cast by the security lamps. From this closer distance, Tom and Linda could see details that made their blood run cold. The figures' heads were larger than human proportions would allow, with features that seemed to shift and blur when looked at directly. Their eyes, if they were eyes, were dark and reflective, like polished obsidian, and they never seemed to blink. But what truly unsettled the Hendersons was the sense of intelligence behind those alien gazes. These weren't mindless creatures or hallucinations. They were conscious beings conducting some kind of deliberate observation, and the Henderson family was clearly the subject of their study. The figures remained motionless for several more minutes, their attention moving from window to window, as if cataloging the inhabitants of the house. Tom noticed that whenever one of them focused on a particular room, he could feel a subtle pressure in his head, like someone gently probing the edges of his thoughts. Then, without any apparent signal or communication between them, the figures began to retreat. They moved backward across the yard in the same gliding motion, never turning away from the house, never breaking their watchful observation. When they reached the property line, they paused for a moment, and Tom had the distinct impression that they were memorizing every detail of what they had seen. Then they were gone, not departed in any normal sense, but simply absent, as if they had stepped out of reality itself. One moment they were standing at the edge of the yard. The next moment the space they had occupied was empty. No movement, no departure, just sudden absence. The Henderson family stood at their back door for a long time, staring at the empty yard and trying to process what they had witnessed. The security lights continued to illuminate the grass where the figures had stood, but there was no sign they had ever been there. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no evidence of their presence except the memory of their impossible visit. Over the following days, the family struggled to come to terms with their experience. Tom and Linda found themselves constantly checking windows and doors, installing additional security measures that they knew, deep down, would be useless against visitors who could appear and disappear at will. Their older children, 13-year-old Jake and 10-year-old Sophie, had slept through the encounter, but they noticed the change in their parents' behavior. The house felt different now, less secure, more exposed. Emma, who had first spotted the watchers, began having nightmares about dark figures standing in her room, observing her while she slept. But perhaps most disturbing was the growing realization that this hadn't been a one-time event. Over the following weeks, the Hendersons began to notice signs that they were still being watched. Security cameras would malfunction at specific times, always at night, always for exactly the duration that would prevent them from recording anything useful. Motion sensors would trigger without apparent cause, but only in patterns that suggested deliberate testing rather than random malfunction. Emma continued to report seeing faces at her window, though the rest of the family never saw the figures again directly. Her descriptions were consistent and detailed, describing the same tall, dark beings with their oversized heads and reflective eyes. She seemed less frightened by their presence than fascinated, which worried her parents more than outright terror would have. Linda began researching similar experiences online and was shocked to discover hundreds of accounts from families who had encountered identical beings. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. Tall, dark figures that observed human families from a distance, showing particular interest in children, appearing and disappearing without explanation, and leaving behind a sense of being continuously monitored. What emerged from Linda's research was a pattern that suggested these visitations weren't random. The families who reported such encounters often had children of specific ages, lived in suburban areas with particular characteristics, and experienced follow-up phenomena that indicated ongoing observation. It was as if the Henderson family had been selected for inclusion in some kind of long-term study. Tom initially resisted this interpretation, preferring to believe their experience had been an isolated incident. But as the signs of continued surveillance accumulated, he was forced to accept that their family had become part of something much larger and more complex than a simple trespassing incident. The knowledge that they were being studied by non-human intelligence was both terrifying and oddly comforting. Terrifying because it meant their privacy and autonomy had been compromised in ways they couldn't prevent or fully understand. Comforting because the beings seemed genuinely interested in observing rather than harming, conducting their research with a careful attention to minimizing disturbance. Months passed, and the Henderson family gradually adapted to their new reality. They learned to live with the knowledge that they were being watched, that their daily routines and family interactions were being recorded and analyzed by intelligence that operated according to completely alien priorities and methods. And sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet and the security lights cast their protective glow across the backyard, Tom would find himself looking out at the empty yard and wondering what conclusions their watchers were drawing about human family life, what aspects of their suburban existence were being cataloged and transmitted to destinations beyond human imagination. The figures never returned in visible form, but their presence lingered in the family's awareness, like a shadow that had become part of their daily lives. They had been chosen for reasons they would never understand, selected to represent humanity in a study whose scope and purpose remained forever beyond their comprehension. But they had survived the encounter, adapted to their new circumstances, and continued to live their lives with the knowledge that they were not alone in the universe, that intelligence existed on scales and in forms that human science was only beginning to glimpse. And perhaps that knowledge, unsettling as it was, made them part of something larger and more significant than their quiet suburban existence had ever suggested possible. These stories of contact and observation reveal something profound about the nature of intelligence in our universe. Whether it's Marcus receiving direct mental communication on a lonely highway, or the Henderson family being studied in their suburban home, we see evidence of consciousness that operates according to principles far beyond our current understanding. But what's particularly striking about these encounters is their restraint. In each case, the non-human intelligence showed remarkable care to minimize harm or disruption. Marcus was given knowledge rather than being subjected to examination. The Henderson family was observed rather than abducted or threatened. These interactions suggest a level of ethical consideration that speaks to consciousness far more advanced than our own. As we continue exploring these encounters, we'll discover that this pattern of careful, purposeful contact appears again and again. These aren't the actions of invaders or conquerors, but of researchers and observers, intelligence that seeks to understand rather than dominate. And perhaps that's the most profound revelation of all, that we share this universe with consciousness that has evolved beyond the territorial and aggressive impulses that still drive much of human behavior. These beings represent what we might become, given enough time and wisdom, explorers of consciousness itself, rather than mere exploiters of resources and territory. The night is still young, and we have more encounters to explore, more glimpses into the vast community of intelligence that surrounds us, always watching, always learning, always maintaining that careful balance between contact and respect for our developing awareness. But sometimes, the most unsettling encounters aren't the ones where beings make contact or observe from a distance. Sometimes, the most disturbing experiences are the ones where people find themselves in places they shouldn't be, witnessing things that seem to exist in the spaces between our normal reality and something far stranger. Our next story comes from David Kowalski, a telecommunications technician from rural Wisconsin who discovered that some maintenance calls take you to locations that don't appear on any map. David had been working for the regional phone company for nearly 15 years, specializing in emergency repairs to remote communication towers scattered across the state's vast wilderness areas. He was used to driving down unmarked forest roads, hiking through dense woods, and working alone in places where cell phone coverage was non existent and the nearest human being might be 50 miles away. In November of 2020, David received a service call that initially seemed routine. A communication tower in the Chequamegon National Forest had gone offline during a severe thunderstorm, and his job was to drive out there, assess the damage, and restore service as quickly as possible. The GPS coordinates led him deep into the forest, down a series of increasingly narrow dirt roads that wound through stands of pine and birch trees already heavy with early snow. But when David reached the coordinates, he found something that shouldn't have existed. The communication tower was there, exactly where it was supposed to be, a standard 200-foot steel structure with the usual array of equipment at its base. But surrounding the tower was a complex that David had never seen in 15 years of servicing remote installations. Buildings constructed from materials he couldn't identify stretched out in a perfect circle around the tower's base. The structures were low and curved, flowing into each other like they had been grown rather than built. Their surfaces had a metallic sheen that shifted color depending on the viewing angle, sometimes appearing silver, sometimes deep blue, sometimes completely transparent. David checked his work orders again, convinced he must have made a navigation error. But the GPS confirmed he was at the correct coordinates, and the tower's identification numbers matched exactly with his service request. This was definitely the right location, but nothing in his company's records had mentioned any additional facilities at this site. As he approached the tower, David noticed that the complex was clearly active. A low humming sound emanated from the buildings, and patterns of light moved beneath their translucent surfaces like slow, deliberate circulation. The air around the facility felt different, charged with energy that made his skin tingle and his hair stand on end. David's training told him to focus on his assigned task. The tower equipment was housed in a standard utility building that looked completely normal compared to the strange structures surrounding it. He unlocked the equipment shed and began his diagnostic routine, testing circuits and checking for storm damage. But as he worked, David became increasingly aware that he was being observed, not by security cameras or human guards, but by something that felt far more immediate and personal. The sensation was strongest when he turned his back to the circular complex, as if eyes were following his every movement from within those flowing, translucent buildings. The tower itself had suffered only minor damage, a few loose connections that David repaired quickly and efficiently. But as he prepared to leave, his curiosity got the better of him. He walked slowly around the perimeter of the strange complex, looking for some indication of what it might be or who might have built it. The buildings had no visible doors or windows, no signs or markings, no indication of their purpose. But as David circled the facility, he began to notice patterns in the light that moved beneath their surfaces. The illumination wasn't random. It followed complex geometric sequences that repeated and evolved, like a visual language he couldn't read, but somehow recognized as meaningful. That's when David heard the sound. It started as a whisper, barely audible above the constant humming of the complex. But as he listened more carefully, the whisper resolved into something that might have been voices, multiple speakers having a conversation in a language that consisted entirely of tones and harmonics. The conversation had an urgent quality, as if the speakers were discussing something important, something that required immediate attention. David realized the voices were coming from directly beneath his feet. He looked down at the ground and saw that he was standing on what appeared to be solid earth, covered with fallen leaves and snow. But the voices were definitely coming from below, suggesting that the complex extended underground as well as above the surface. Whatever this facility was, it was far larger and more elaborate than its visible structures indicated. As David stood, listening to the underground conversation, one of the translucent buildings began to change. Its surface became more transparent, revealing glimpses of the interior space within. What David saw made his breath catch in his throat. The building was filled with equipment that seemed to exist at the intersection of technology and biology. Organic-looking structures pulsed with internal light, connected by networks of what might have been cables or might have been living tissue. And moving among this hybrid machinery were figures that were clearly not human. They were tall and graceful, with elongated limbs and smooth, pale skin that seemed to glow with its own internal radiance. Their movements were fluid and purposeful as they tended to the strange equipment, adjusting controls that had no visible buttons or switches, monitoring displays that showed information in symbols David couldn't begin to interpret. One of the figures looked up and saw David watching through the transparent wall. Their eyes met across the impossible barrier between human and non-human reality, and David felt a shock of recognition that seemed to bypass his conscious mind entirely. The being studied him with an expression that might have been curiosity or concern, or perhaps something far more complex than human emotions could accommodate. Then the building's surface became opaque again, hiding the interior from David's view. But the encounter had lasted long enough for him to understand that he had witnessed something extraordinary, a glimpse into a level of reality that operated alongside human civilization but remained completely hidden from normal perception. David backed away from the complex, his heart racing as he processed what he had seen. The voices from underground had stopped, and the humming from the buildings had decreased to barely audible levels. It was as if the facility had somehow become aware of his presence and was taking steps to minimize its visibility. He returned to his truck and drove away as quickly as the narrow forest roads would allow, glancing repeatedly in his rearview mirror to see if the complex was still visible. But as he gained distance, the strange buildings seemed to fade, becoming harder to distinguish from the surrounding forest until they disappeared entirely. When David reached the main highway and regained cell phone coverage, he immediately called his supervisor to report the completion of his service call. But he made no mention of the complex surrounding the tower, instinctively understanding that such a report would either be dismissed as hallucination or would result in attention he wasn't prepared to handle. Over the following days, David researched the location extensively, searching satellite imagery and government databases for any reference to facilities in that area of the national forest. He found nothing. According to every official record he could access, the communication tower stood alone in empty wilderness, exactly as it appeared in his company's service records. But David knew what he had seen, and the memory of those graceful figures tending their hybrid machinery remained vivid and undeniable. He had stumbled upon evidence that Earth was host to intelligence far more advanced than humanity, consciousness that had learned to exist in the spaces between human awareness and conventional reality. The experience changed David's relationship with his work. Every service call to remote locations now carried the possibility of extraordinary discovery. He found himself paying closer attention to anomalies in the landscape, inconsistencies in his GPS readings, places where the normal rules of geography and technology seemed to bend in subtle but significant ways. And sometimes, late at night when he was working alone at isolated communication sites, David would catch glimpses of things that shouldn't have been there. Lights moving through the forest with too much purpose to be natural phenomena, structures that appeared solid until he looked directly at them, sounds that suggested vast machinery operating just beyond the range of human perception. David never encountered the complex again, but he carried the knowledge of its existence like a secret that connected him to mysteries far greater than routine maintenance work. He had been allowed to witness something remarkable, a glimpse behind the curtain that separated ordinary reality from the vast hidden infrastructure that supported intelligence beyond human imagination. And perhaps that glimpse had been intentional, a carefully managed revelation designed to expand his awareness without overwhelming his ability to process such knowledge. The beings he had seen through that transparent wall had looked at him with recognition, as if his presence at their facility had been expected, even planned. The universe, David realized, was far more complex and populated than human science had yet discovered. And sometimes, if you were in the right place at the right time and had the awareness to recognize what you were seeing, you might catch a glimpse of the vast community of consciousness that shared this reality with humanity. Our next encounter takes us beneath the surface of the Earth itself, to the extensive cave systems that honeycomb the landscape of Kentucky. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a geologist specializing in underground water systems, discovered that some caverns contain more than just rock formations and ancient minerals. Elena had been exploring the Mammoth Cave region for her doctoral research, mapping underground water flows and studying the geological processes that had created one of the world's most extensive cave networks. She was an experienced spelunker, comfortable with the challenges of underground exploration and familiar with the unique environment of deep cave systems. But on a research expedition, In March of 2021, Elena ventured into passages that led her far beyond the boundaries of known cave networks, into spaces that seemed to exist according to different physical laws than the surface world above. Elena was following an underground stream that had been carved through limestone over millions of years, documenting the water's path as it wound deeper into the earth. Her equipment included GPS units, water sampling gear, and powerful LED lights that could illuminate cave passages for hundreds of feet. She was alone, as she preferred to be during detailed scientific work, connected to the surface team by radio equipment that functioned reliably in most cave conditions. The passage she was following gradually widened into a vast underground chamber, far larger than anything shown on existing cave maps. Elena's lights revealed a space so enormous that their beams couldn't reach the ceilings or far walls, creating the impression of standing in an underground cathedral of impossible dimensions. But what truly captured Elena's attention wasn't the size of the chamber, it was what occupied it. Structures rose from the cavern floor like massive crystal formations, but with geometries that seemed too perfect to be natural. They were translucent and multifaceted, catching and reflecting Elena's lights in patterns that created rainbow cascades across the cavern walls. Some of the structures reached toward the invisible ceiling in spiraling columns, while others spread horizontally in web-like networks that connected different areas of the chamber. Elena approached the nearest formation cautiously, her geological training telling her that she was looking at something unprecedented in cave science. The structures appeared to be made of crystallized material, but their internal organization was far more complex than any natural crystal formation she had ever studied. As she moved her lights across the surface of the nearest structure, Elena noticed that it wasn't completely solid. Patterns of light moved within the crystal matrix, flowing like slow currents through channels that seemed to exist in 3 dimensions simultaneously. The light had a soft, organic quality that reminded her more of bioluminescence than mineral phosphorescence. That's when Elena realized the structures were alive, not alive in any conventional biological sense, but conscious and responsive in ways that challenged every assumption she had about the nature of life itself. As she watched, the patterns of internal light began to synchronize across multiple structures, creating waves of illumination that swept through the entire chamber like slow, deliberate communication. Elena tried to record what she was seeing, but her camera equipment was behaving strangely. Images that looked perfectly clear on the LCD screen appeared completely black when she reviewed them later. Her GPS units were showing impossible readings, indicating that she was simultaneously at multiple locations hundreds of miles apart. Even her radio, which had been functioning normally throughout her descent, now produced only a low harmonic tone that seemed to resonate with the light patterns in the crystal structures. As Elena stood in the center of the chamber, surrounded by these impossible living formations, she began to sense that she was in the presence of intelligence far older than human civilization. The structures weren't just alive, they were ancient, having existed in this underground realm for geological ages that dwarfed the entire span of human history, and they were aware of her presence. The light patterns within the structures began to change, becoming more complex and directed. Elena had the distinct impression that the formations were studying her, analyzing her biological and technological signatures with a thoroughness that felt both fascinating and slightly invasive. She could feel their attention like a gentle pressure in her mind, curious but not threatening. Then the structures began to communicate with her directly, not through sound or visual signals, but through impressions that appeared in her consciousness as fully formed concepts. Elena found herself understanding things about the Earth's deep structure that weren't in any geology textbook, comprehending processes that occurred on timescales so vast that human perception could barely encompass them. She learned that these crystal beings were part of a planetary consciousness that existed in the deep places of the Earth, a form of life that had evolved in the spaces between rock and mineral, sustaining itself on geological processes and electromagnetic fields. They were the Earth's memory, recording and preserving information about every major event in the planet's history. Through their communication, Elena glimpsed visions of the Earth's formation, the development of its atmosphere and oceans, the emergence and extinction of countless life forms over billions of years. She saw the rise and fall of civilizations that had existed long before humanity, intelligence that had learned to work in harmony with planetary processes rather than against them. But most remarkably, she understood that these beings had been waiting for humanity to develop sufficient awareness to make contact. They had been observing human civilization's relationship with the Earth, watching as humanity learned to dig deeper and explore more extensively, hoping that eventually human consciousness would expand enough to recognize their presence. Elena was one of the first humans to achieve that recognition, and through her, the crystal beings were extending an invitation to her species. They wanted to share their vast knowledge of planetary processes to help humanity understand how to live in sustainable harmony with the Earth's deep systems. The communication lasted for what felt like hours, but when Elena checked her equipment, she discovered that only minutes had passed. Time itself seemed to operate differently in the presence of these ancient consciousnesses, stretching and contracting according to the requirements of the information being shared. As the exchange concluded, Elena felt the beings withdrawing their direct contact, but not their attention. They would continue to monitor her progress, they indicated, and through her they would begin the slow process of establishing broader communication with human science. Elena made her way back through the cave passages, following her marked route to the surface. But when she reached the entrance and rejoined her surface team, she discovered that her experience in the deep chamber couldn't be easily documented or shared. Her equipment showed no record of the vast cavern or the crystal structures. Her GPS logs indicated she had never left the known cave passages, and her radio communications with the surface team showed no interruption. But Elena carried with her the knowledge and understanding that had been shared by the crystal beings, information about planetary processes and geological relationships that would revolutionize her field if she could find ways to present it without revealing its impossible source. Over the following months, Elena published several groundbreaking papers on underground water systems and mineral formation, introducing concepts that seemed to come from nowhere but proved remarkably accurate when tested. Her colleagues attributed her insights to exceptional intuition and analytical skill, never suspecting that her knowledge came from direct communication with the Earth's own consciousness. Elena continued her cave explorations, but she never found the vast chamber again. However, she began to notice subtle signs of the crystal being's presence in other underground locations, faint light patterns in mineral formations, harmonic resonances in cave acoustics, suggestions that the planetary consciousness existed throughout the Earth's deep structure, waiting patiently for humanity to develop the awareness necessary for broader contact. And sometimes, when Elena was working alone in deep cave systems, she would feel that familiar, gentle pressure in her mind, the sensation of ancient intelligence observing her work with approval and encouragement. She had become part of something far larger than geological research, a bridge between human science and planetary consciousness that operated on scales beyond individual human comprehension. The crystal beings had chosen her to begin a process of contact and communication that might take generations to fully develop. But the foundation had been established, and through Elena's work, humanity was taking its first tentative steps toward recognizing the vast intelligence that had always existed beneath their feet. These underground encounters remind us that intelligence takes forms we're only beginning to imagine. While we search the skies for signs of extraterrestrial consciousness, we may be overlooking the vast communities of awareness that exist in the hidden spaces of our own planet. David's discovery of the hybrid facility in the Wisconsin forest, Elena's communication with the crystal beings deep beneath Kentucky, these experiences suggest that Earth itself hosts multiple levels of consciousness, intelligence that has learned to exist in the spaces between human awareness and conventional reality. What's particularly striking about these encounters is their educational nature. In each case, the non-human intelligence seemed intent on expanding human understanding rather than concealing their presence. David was allowed to witness advanced technology that operated according to principles beyond current human science. Elena was given direct access to planetary knowledge that revolutionized her geological research. These beings appear to be teachers, consciousness that has evolved beyond the competitive and territorial impulses that still drive much of human behavior. They represent what we might become if we learn to see ourselves as part of larger systems rather than separate from them. But perhaps most importantly, these encounters suggest that the next phase of human evolution may not involve traveling to distant stars to find intelligence, but rather developing the awareness to recognize the vast community of consciousness that already surrounds us, hidden in plain sight within the complex systems of our own planet. As we continue our journey through these extraordinary accounts, we'll discover that this pattern of hidden intelligence and patient education appears throughout human experience, waiting for us to develop the perceptual tools necessary to recognize what has always been there. The night is deepening around us, and we have more encounters to explore, more glimpses into the vast tapestry of consciousness that weaves through every level of reality, from the depths of the earth to the furthest reaches of space, all of it connected by awareness that transcends the boundaries of species, planet, and even physical form itself. Our next story takes us to the Australian outback, where the vast emptiness of the continent's interior provides the perfect backdrop for encounters that challenge our understanding of both space and time. Rebecca Walsh was a wildlife photographer who specialized in documenting the unique ecosystems of remote desert regions. She had spent 3 years working on a comprehensive photographic survey of Australia's most isolated wilderness areas, traveling alone with specialized equipment designed to capture the subtle beauty of landscapes that most people would consider barren and lifeless. In September of 2020, Rebecca was camped near Uluru, the massive monolithic rock formation that rises from the Red Desert like a stone monument to geological time. She had positioned her campsite several miles from the main tourist areas, seeking the kind of absolute solitude that allowed for the patient observation wildlife photography required. Rebecca had been photographing the changing light on Uluru's surface as the sun set, documenting the way the rock's color shifted from deep red to purple to almost black as darkness fell across the desert. She was preparing to set up her equipment for night photography when she noticed something unusual in the star-filled sky above the monolith. What she initially took for a bright star was moving, drifting slowly across the constellation patterns with a steady, purposeful motion that clearly wasn't natural. Rebecca grabbed her telephoto lens and focused on the object, expecting to see an airplane or satellite passing overhead. Instead, she found herself looking at something that defied every category her mind tried to apply to it. The object appeared to be a structure rather than a vehicle, a complex geometric arrangement of interconnected modules that rotated slowly around a central core. Each module glowed with its own internal light, creating patterns that shifted and evolved as the structure moved through space. The entire assemblage was enormous, easily the size of a city block, yet it moved with the silent grace of something weightless. Rebecca began photographing frantically, using her most powerful telephoto lenses to capture detail of the impossible structure. Through her viewfinder, she could see that the modules weren't solid objects, but rather frameworks containing what looked like flowing energy or liquid light. The patterns within each module seemed to respond to the patterns in adjacent modules, creating a complex symphony of light and motion that suggested the entire structure was a single, coordinated organism. As Rebecca watched and photographed, the structure began to change. The modules rearranged themselves into new configurations, sometimes clustering tightly around the central core, sometimes spreading out in elaborate geometric patterns that spanned hundreds of feet. Each reconfiguration seemed to serve a different purpose, as if the structure was adapting itself to perform various functions as it moved through space. Then the structure stopped moving and began to descend. Rebecca watched in amazement as the massive assemblage lowered itself toward the desert floor, its modules continuing their slow rotation and reconfiguration as it approached the ground. The structure settled onto the flat plain about 2 miles from Uluru, its base modules making contact with the red sand without creating any disturbance or impact crater. Once the structure had landed, its activity intensified. The light patterns within the modules became more complex and rapid, and new elements began to emerge from the central core. These appeared to be smaller, more mobile components that detached from the main structure and began to spread out across the desert in carefully coordinated patterns. Rebecca realized she was witnessing some kind of systematic exploration or data collection operation. The mobile components moved across the landscape with obvious purpose, pausing at specific locations to conduct what appeared to be detailed examinations of the soil, rock formations, and sparse vegetation. Each component worked independently, yet their activities were clearly coordinated as part of a larger investigative effort. As Rebecca continued photographing this extraordinary scene, she became aware that she herself was being observed. One of the mobile components had approached her position and was hovering about 50 feet away, its sensors or attention clearly focused on her and her equipment. The component was roughly spherical, about the size of a small car, with a surface that seemed to exist somewhere between solid matter and pure energy. Patterns of light moved across its exterior in complex cascades that reminded Rebecca of neural activity or electrical circuits firing in sequence. She had the distinct impression that it was analyzing her, gathering information about her biological and technological characteristics. Rebecca continued photographing, documenting this unprecedented encounter between human and non-human intelligence. The component seemed to approve of her activity, moving closer to give her better angles for her shots, as if it understood what she was trying to accomplish and wanted to assist in the documentation process. Through her telephoto lens, Rebecca could see incredible detail in the component's structure. What she had taken for a solid surface was actually composed of countless tiny elements that moved and reorganized themselves constantly, like a swarm of microscopic entities working in perfect coordination. The patterns of light weren't just surface phenomena, but seemed to represent actual communication or computation occurring within the component's distributed consciousness. After several minutes of this mutual observation, the component began to emit a soft musical tone, a complex harmonic that seemed to carry meaning beyond mere sound. Rebecca found herself understanding, without knowing how, that the component was attempting to communicate with her. The tone shifted and evolved, becoming more elaborate and structured, like a language of pure music. Rebecca had no way to respond in kind, but she continued photographing, documenting every detail of this first contact between human consciousness and the distributed intelligence of the mysterious structure. Then the component did something that would stay with Rebecca for the rest of her life. It projected a holographic image into the air between them, a three-dimensional display that showed Rebecca herself standing in the desert with her camera, photographing the component. But the image continued, showing her returning to her campsite, developing her photographs, sharing them with colleagues, and eventually with the world. The hologram expanded to show the impact of these photographs on human understanding, the way they would challenge scientific assumptions and expand human awareness of intelligence in the universe. Rebecca saw herself becoming part of a larger process of contact and revelation, her documentation serving as evidence that would help prepare humanity for broader recognition of non-human consciousness. The holographic projection faded, and the component began to retreat, returning to the main structure across the desert. As it departed, Rebecca felt a profound sense of gratitude and responsibility. She had been chosen to document this encounter, to serve as a bridge between human and non-human intelligence. Over the following hour, Rebecca watched as the mobile components completed their survey of the area and returned to the main structure. The modules began reconfiguring again, preparing for departure. The light patterns intensified briefly, creating a spectacular display against the star-filled sky. Then the entire assemblage began to rise. The structure ascended slowly at first, then with increasing speed, its modules rotating and reconfiguring as it climbed into the night sky. Within minutes, it had become just another point of light among the stars, indistinguishable from the natural celestial objects that filled the desert sky. Rebecca remained at her observation point until dawn, processing what she had witnessed and reviewing the hundreds of photographs she had taken. When she examined the images on her camera's LCD screen, she was amazed to find that every shot had captured extraordinary detail of the structure and its components. The photographs clearly showed the geometric configurations, the light patterns, and even the holographic projection that had communicated with her. But when Rebecca returned to civilization and attempted to upload the photographs to her computer, she discovered that the images had changed. They still showed the structure and the encounter, but with a subtle difference that made them seem less impossible, more open to conventional explanation. The images were still remarkable, but they no longer carried the overwhelming sense of otherworldly intelligence that had been so apparent during the actual encounter. Rebecca realized that the intelligence behind the structure had somehow modified her photographs, ensuring that they would serve as evidence without being so overwhelming that they would cause panic or disbelief. The images were designed to expand human awareness gradually, preparing consciousness for broader contact rather than shocking it with revelations it wasn't ready to process. She published the photographs as part of her wilderness documentation project, describing them as unusual atmospheric phenomena captured during her desert work. The images attracted significant attention from both scientific and public audiences, generating discussion about unknown natural processes and the possibility of rare meteorological events. But Rebecca knew the truth behind the photographs, and she carried that knowledge with a sense of profound responsibility. She had been chosen to document humanity's first visual evidence of organized non-human intelligence, and her images would serve as a foundation for the gradual process of contact and recognition that was already beginning. Over the following months, Rebecca continued her photography work, but with a new awareness of the vast intelligence that surrounded human civilization. She found herself noticing subtle signs of non-human presence in other remote locations, patterns in natural phenomena that suggested observation and study by consciousness far more advanced than human science had yet recognized. And sometimes, when she was working alone in the deep wilderness, Rebecca would catch glimpses of light in the sky that moved with too much purpose to be natural, structures that appeared at the edge of vision before fading back into the ordinary landscape, reminders that their encounter at Uluru had been part of something far larger and more ongoing than a single isolated event. The photographs she had taken that night remained her most treasured professional achievement, not because of the recognition they brought her, but because they represented proof that humanity was not alone in its exploration of consciousness and meaning. Somewhere among the stars, vast intelligences were conducting their own investigations, their own attempts to understand the nature of existence itself. And Rebecca had been privileged to witness a moment when those parallel explorations intersected, when human curiosity met non-human wisdom in the vast emptiness of the Australian desert, creating a bridge of understanding that would help prepare both species for the broader contact that was surely coming. Our final encounter tonight takes us to the frozen landscapes of northern Alaska, where the extreme isolation and harsh conditions create an environment where the impossible becomes simply another aspect of survival. James Thornfield was a bush pilot who had been flying supplies to remote villages and research stations across Alaska's North Slope for over 20 years. He knew the territory better than almost anyone, every landmark and weather pattern, every safe landing strip and emergency shelter scattered across thousands of square miles of tundra and mountains. But on a supply run to a geological survey camp in February of 2021, James encountered weather conditions that seemed to exist outside the normal patterns of Arctic meteorology, and within those conditions, he discovered something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the nature of reality itself. James was flying his modified Cessna 206 from Fairbanks to a temporary research camp established on the shore of the Beaufort Sea. The camp was studying permafrost changes related to climate research, and James had been contracted to deliver equipment and supplies that couldn't be transported by ground vehicles across the trackless wilderness. The flight began normally, with clear skies and calm winds that made for easy flying conditions. But as James approached the research camp's coordinates, he encountered a weather front that appeared on none of his forecasting equipment and didn't match any meteorological pattern he had experienced in 2 decades of Arctic flying. The front manifested as a wall of fog that rose from the tundra to altitudes far higher than Arctic fog should have been able to sustain. The wall was perfectly straight, stretching across the horizon like a curtain that divided the clear sky from something else entirely. James could see that the fog bank was moving, but not with the wind. It was advancing across the landscape with steady, purposeful motion that suggested intelligence rather than natural meteorological processes. James tried to radio the research camp to report the unusual weather conditions, but his communications equipment was receiving interference that sounded like voices speaking in harmonized tones. The interference wasn't static or electronic noise, but rather organized sound that seemed to carry meaning, even though James couldn't understand what that meaning might be. As he approached the fog wall, James noticed that the temperature outside his aircraft was rising rather than falling, contrary to everything he knew about Arctic weather systems. His instruments showed readings that made no sense, atmospheric pressure fluctuations that should have been impossible, electromagnetic signatures that suggested the presence of technology far more advanced than anything human civilization had developed. James made the decision to fly into the fog bank, partly because his fuel situation required him to reach the research camp, but mostly because his curiosity as a pilot demanded that he understand what he was encountering. As his aircraft entered the wall of fog, the world outside his windows changed completely. The fog wasn't empty. Instead, it was filled with structures that seemed to exist somewhere between solid matter and pure energy. James could see geometric forms that stretched for miles in every direction, interconnected frameworks that pulsed with internal light and moved with fluid, organic motion. The structures appeared to be artificial, constructed according to principles of engineering, that operated beyond the limitations of conventional physics. Within these impossible constructions, James glimpsed activity that suggested a vast, coordinated effort of some kind. Forms that might have been vehicles or might have been living entities moved between the geometric frameworks, tending to equipment or processes that James couldn't begin to categorize. The scale of the operation was enormous, encompassing volumes of space that should have been empty Arctic atmosphere. James flew through this impossible landscape for what felt like hours, though his instruments indicated that only minutes were passing. The geometric structures extended in every direction, creating a three-dimensional maze that seemed to have no boundaries or limits. Occasionally, some of the entities within the structures would pause in their activities to observe his aircraft, but they showed no sign of hostility or concern about his presence. Instead, James had the distinct impression that his flight through their domain was expected, even welcomed. The entities seemed to be studying his reactions to their environment, cataloging his responses to technology and consciousness that operated according to principles his human mind could barely comprehend. As James continued flying through this impossible realm, he began to understand that he was witnessing something far more significant than unusual weather. This was a glimpse into a level of reality that existed alongside human civilization but remained completely hidden from normal perception. The entities operating within these geometric structures were conducting activities that spanned dimensions and timescales beyond human comprehension. Then the fog began to clear, and James found himself approaching the research camp exactly as his flight plan had indicated. The transition from the impossible landscape back to normal Arctic terrain was so seamless that he questioned whether the experience had been real at all. But his instruments still showed the anomalous readings, and the harmonic interference in his radio equipment continued for several more minutes before fading to normal static. James landed at the research camp and delivered his supplies, but he made no mention of his flight through the fog bank to the scientists stationed there. When he asked them about unusual weather conditions in the area, they reported that the day had been completely clear, with no fog or atmospheric disturbances of any kind. That night, as James prepared for his return flight to Fairbanks, one of the researchers approached him privately. Dr. Sarah Chen, the team's atmospheric scientist, had been monitoring electromagnetic readings as part of her climate research, and she had detected massive energy signatures during the exact time period when James had been flying through the fog bank. The readings indicated the presence of technology that operated on principles completely unknown to human science, she explained. Energy generation and manipulation on scales that suggested civilization far more advanced than anything on Earth. But the readings had lasted only minutes before disappearing completely, leaving no trace of their source. Dr. Chen asked James if he had noticed anything unusual during his flight, but something in her manner suggested she already knew more than she was revealing. James described his experience in general terms, and Dr. Chen nodded with the expression of someone who had suspected exactly what he was telling her. She revealed that similar electromagnetic signatures had been detected at research stations across the Arctic, always brief, always incredibly powerful, always associated with atmospheric disturbances that appeared on no official weather monitoring systems. The scientific community was beginning to recognize that something extraordinary was occurring in the remote regions of the planet, but the evidence was too fragmentary and too impossible to report through conventional channels. Dr. Chen showed James data from her instruments, readings that clearly indicated the presence of massive structures and coordinated activity in the atmosphere above their research camp. The data matched perfectly with James's account of flying through geometric frameworks filled with purposeful entities, providing scientific confirmation of his impossible experience. Over the following months, James began connecting with other pilots who flew in remote regions around the world. Through informal networks and careful conversations, he discovered that many of them had encountered similar phenomena: fog banks that contained impossible structures, atmospheric conditions that defied meteorological principles, glimpses of activity that suggested vast intelligence operating in the spaces between human awareness. The pilots had developed their own informal reporting system, sharing information about locations and conditions where such encounters were most likely to occur. They spoke of coordinates where the normal rules of aviation seemed to bend, flight paths that led through dimensions of reality that weren't supposed to exist, encounters with consciousness that operated on scales beyond human imagination. James realized that he had become part of a growing community of witnesses, people whose work took them to the edges of human civilization, where the boundaries between possible and impossible became permeable. Pilots, researchers, technicians, and explorers who had glimpsed evidence of intelligence that surrounded human society, but remained carefully hidden from general awareness. These encounters weren't random or accidental, James understood. They were part of a gradual process of contact and revelation, carefully managed to expand human consciousness without overwhelming it. The beings behind these phenomena were introducing themselves slowly, selectively, to individuals who were most likely to process such knowledge constructively. And perhaps most importantly, James realized that his role as a witness came with responsibility. He had been chosen to see beyond the normal boundaries of reality, and that vision carried with it an obligation to help prepare humanity for the broader contact that was surely coming. The Arctic wilderness that had always been his professional domain now felt vastly different, no longer empty, but filled with hidden activity and intelligence. Every flight carried the possibility of extraordinary encounter. Every unusual weather pattern might conceal glimpses of reality that operated according to principles human science was only beginning to discover. James continued his work as a bush pilot, but with the knowledge that he was flying through airspace, shared with consciousness far more advanced than human civilization. The vast emptiness of the Arctic was an illusion, concealing levels of activity and intelligence that spanned dimensions beyond normal human perception. And sometimes, when conditions were just right and the barriers between realities grew thin, James would catch glimpses of that hidden realm again, geometric structures stretching across impossible distances, entities moving with purpose through frameworks of organized energy, reminders that the universe was far more complex and populated than humanity had yet learned to recognize. These encounters, throughout our night together, from Sarah's hospital window to James's flight through impossible fog, reveal a pattern that suggests something profound about the nature of consciousness in our universe. We've seen evidence of intelligence that operates on multiple levels of reality, from the depths of the Earth to the furthest reaches of space, all of it connected by awareness that transcends the boundaries we thought were absolute. What strikes me most about these accounts isn't their strangeness, but their consistency. Across different locations, as different witnesses, different circumstances, we see the same careful approach to contact. These intelligences don't invade or conquer, they observe and educate. They don't overwhelm or terrify, they gradually expand awareness. They seem to understand that consciousness itself is precious, something to be nurtured rather than dominated. Sarah watching coordinated lights above a darkened neighborhood, Tom witnessing graceful figures in amber glow, Jennifer discovering intelligence in the deep ocean, Marcus receiving direct mental communication on a lonely highway, the Henderson family being studied with scientific precision, David glimpsing hybrid technology in hidden facilities, Elena communicating with planetary consciousness, Rebecca documenting vast structures in the Australian desert, James flying through impossible geometric realms. Each witness was changed by their encounter, but not broken by it. Each was given knowledge that expanded their understanding of reality without destroying their ability to function within it. This suggests intelligence that has learned wisdom, consciousness that has evolved beyond the competitive and destructive impulses that still drive much of human behavior. Perhaps these encounters are showing us what we might become, given enough time and growth. Explorers of consciousness rather than exploiters of resources. Observers and teachers rather than conquerors and destroyers. Intelligence that seeks to understand and nurture rather than dominate and control. The night is ending, and dawn will soon return us to the familiar world of routine and predictability. But the knowledge we've shared tonight remains, a reminder that reality is far larger and stranger than our daily lives allow us to consider. The universe is not empty, consciousness is not rare, and intelligence takes forms we're only beginning to imagine. As you return to your normal routines, carry with you the possibility that every clear night sky might contain evidence of vast intelligence. Every quiet moment in nature might offer glimpses of consciousness that operates beyond human understanding. Every strange light or unusual sound might be an invitation to expand your awareness of what's really possible in this extraordinary universe we share. And if you find yourself lying awake tonight, staring at the ceiling and thinking about these stories, remember that every witness we've heard from was once just like you. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives until the extraordinary found them. They didn't seek out these encounters. They simply remained open to possibilities beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. The nurse working her night shift, the rancher checking his fences, the scientist exploring the deep ocean, the trucker driving empty highways, the family in their suburban home, the technician servicing remote equipment, the geologist mapping underground systems, the photographer documenting wilderness, the pilot navigating Arctic skies. None of them expected to become part of something larger than themselves, yet each played a crucial role in a process of contact and revelation that continues to unfold around us. These encounters suggest that we're living through a gradual awakening, a slow expansion of human consciousness that's been carefully orchestrated over decades, perhaps centuries. The intelligence behind these phenomena seems to understand that awareness must grow organically, that revelation forced too quickly becomes trauma rather than enlightenment. They're teaching us, step by step, encounter by encounter, that we're part of something infinitely larger than our individual lives or even our species. The boundaries we've drawn around reality, the limitations we've accepted about what's possible, the isolation we've assumed defines our existence in the universe, all of these are dissolving as more people witness the impossible and carry that knowledge forward. But perhaps the most beautiful aspect of these encounters is their gentleness. Despite possessing technology that could overwhelm us, consciousness that could dominate us, knowledge that could shatter our worldview entirely, these intelligences approach us with patience and care. They seem to understand that consciousness itself is sacred, something to be nurtured and protected rather than conquered or controlled. They're showing us not just that we're not alone, but that we're part of a community of awareness that spans dimensions, species, and scales of existence we can barely comprehend. The earth beneath our feet hosts ancient crystalline consciousness. The oceans around us conceal vast moving intelligences. The skies above us carry geometric structures of impossible complexity. The very air we breathe vibrates with communications in languages of pure meaning. And through it all, these intelligences wait patiently for us to develop the awareness necessary to recognize what has always been there, the vast tapestry of consciousness that weaves through every level of reality, connecting all things in patterns of meaning and purpose that transcend individual understanding. As you drift toward sleep tonight, let these stories settle into your consciousness like seeds planted in fertile ground, not as entertainment or distraction, but as glimpses of truth that will grow and develop as your own awareness expands. The universe is stranger and more wonderful than we've dared to imagine, and we're just beginning to glimpse the edges of its infinite mystery. The darkness outside your window is an empty space punctuated by distant stars. It's alive with intelligence, rich with consciousness, filled with beings who share our curiosity about existence and our wonder at the nature of reality itself. They're out there, not as invaders or conquerors, but as fellow explorers in the vast journey of awareness that connects all conscious beings across time and space. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers. May your sleep be filled with visions of impossible beauty, and your waking hours touched by the knowledge that you're never truly alone in this extraordinary universe we call home. Until next time, this has been Bedtime Horror, where the darkness holds more than just dreams, and the truth is always stranger than fiction. Rest well, and remember to keep looking up,